And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode explores George Orwell's life, philosophy, and literary legacy, examining how his ideas on totalitarianism, propaganda, surveillance, and truth remain profoundly relevant today. Through an analysis of his works, including 1984 Animal Farm and his essays on language and politics, we uncover Orwell's warnings about the dangers of ideological control, the manipulation of history, and the erosion of free thought. From his experiences in Burma and Spain to his unyielding commitment to exposing authoritarianism, Orwell's intellectual journey continues to shape modern political and philosophical discourse. For book recommendations related to this episode, further research topics, key search terms, and a way to buy me a coffee, visit the episode page. Let's dive in. George Orwell was a man of contradictions, shaped by a life of experiences that placed him in the tension between power and resistance, privilege and oppression, conviction and disillusionment. Born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903 in British-controlled India, he grew up in a lower upper-middle-class family, a social position that allowed him access to elite institutions, but left him always conscious of his precarious standing. Educated at Eton, he did not follow the traditional trajectory of his classmates into government or finance. Instead, he chose the life of an outsider, rejecting comfort in favour of a first-hand understanding of the struggles of the working class. His experiences as an imperial police officer in Burma, a dishwasher in Paris, a tramp in London, and a militia fighter in Spain all fed into his writing, imbuing it with a clarity of vision that few writers of his time possessed. From an early age, Orwell saw the world as a battleground for competing ideologies, each vying not only for power, but for the ability to define reality itself. His time in Burma opened his eyes to the brutal mechanics of empire, instilling in him a profound hatred for colonial oppression. His time in the slums of Paris and London exposed him to the grinding despair of poverty, while his journey to Wigan Pier revealed to him the deep injustices of industrial Britain. Yet, it was the Spanish Civil War that proved the most formative, offering him a direct, visceral encounter with the hypocrisy and brutality of totalitarianism on both the right and the left. His disillusionment with Soviet communism following the war turned him into one of the fiercest critics of ideological dogmatism, even as he maintained a lifelong commitment to democratic socialism. Orwell's writing was defined by an unrelenting commitment to truth, a refusal to obscure reality with comforting illusions or ideological platitudes. He understood, perhaps more than any of his contemporaries, that language itself could be weaponized, that power was not only exerted through violence but through the manipulation of thought. His essays, novels, and journalistic pieces all centered on the urgent need for intellectual integrity in a world increasingly dominated by propaganda and deception. Whether he was dissecting the euphemisms of political speech, exposing the duplicity of totalitarian regimes, or cautioning against the dangers of historical revisionism, Orwell wrote with a clarity that cut through obfuscation like a blade. His greatest works, Animal Farm and 1984, were not simply critiques of the systems they satirized, but warnings for the future, prophecies that have only grown more prescient with time. In Animal Farm, he captured the inevitable corruption of revolutionary ideals, the way power consolidates itself regardless of its initial intent. In 1984, he articulated a vision of surveillance, censorship, and manufactured reality that resonates with disturbing accuracy in the digital age. Orwell did not merely diagnose the political crises of his own era, he laid bare the mechanisms by which power perpetuates itself, making his work indispensable for understanding the crises of today. Totalitarianism, as Orwell saw it, was not simply a matter of political oppression or authoritarian rule. It was an all-encompassing system designed to dominate not only actions but thoughts, perceptions, and even reality itself. In Orwell's dystopian vision, power did not merely impose its will through violence or coercion. It rewrote history, reshaped language, and redefined truth until resistance itself became impossible. He understood that the most insidious form of control was not the visible brutality of a police state, but the internalized self-censorship that totalitarianism demanded. When the boundaries of permissible thought were narrowed, when language was manipulated to eliminate the very possibility of dissent, the mere concept of freedom could be eradicated without the need for overt force. This insight formed the foundation of 1984, a novel that remains one of the most haunting explorations of power ever written. Orwell's understanding of totalitarianism was shaped by his lived experiences, particularly his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War, where he witnessed firsthand how ideological purges and propaganda were used to suppress opposition. He saw how truth could be rewritten, how history could be altered to suit the needs of those in power, and how fear and loyalty could be manufactured through relentless surveillance and psychological coercion. The party's slogan in 1984, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," encapsulates Orwell's belief that control over historical narratives was one of the most effective tools of authoritarian rule. If people could be made to forget the past or accept its constant revision, then they could be made to accept any version of reality imposed upon them. One of Orwell's most chilling insights was that totalitarianism did not merely seek obedience. It sought to obliterate the distinction between truth and falsehood, to make its subjects incapable of distinguishing between reality and fiction. The concept of double-think, in which contradictory beliefs are accepted simultaneously, was Orwell's way of illustrating how oppressive regimes condition people to surrender their ability to think critically. The party's manipulation of facts, its ability to erase records and replace them with fabricated ones, was not just a function of state power but of psychological domination. Orwell understood that a population that no longer trusted its own memory, that accepted contradictions as truth, was one that could be controlled absolutely. Yet Orwell did not see totalitarianism as an abstract or distant threat. He believed its impulses could emerge anywhere, in any society, if vigilance was not maintained. He warned that the methods of control described in 1984, mass surveillance, thought control, and the suppression of independent thought, could take hold in democratic societies as well, not necessarily through violent oppression, but through gradual cultural shifts, political complacency, and the erosion of intellectual freedom. His work serves as both a warning and a challenge, urging people to recognize the subtle ways in which power seeks to reshape reality and to resist before it becomes impossible to do so. Language is not a neutral tool, but a battlefield where power is contested and reality is shaped. Orwell understood that those who controlled language controlled thought itself, and in 1984, he illustrated this principle through Newspeak, a deliberately restrictive language designed to eliminate subversive ideas by making them linguistically impossible to express. The principle of linguistic determinism, which suggests that language structures influence or even dictate human thought, was not merely an academic theory for Orwell. It was a lived political reality. He saw firsthand how totalitarian regimes manipulated language to obscure truth, whether through euphemisms that sanitized atrocities or outright lies that reshaped historical memory. By controlling the vocabulary available to people, authoritarian systems could not only dictate what could be said, but, more insidiously, what could be thought. Beyond the fictional confines of 1984, Orwell's concern with the manipulation of language was deeply rooted in real-world politics. In his seminal essay, Politics in the English Language, he exposed how political rhetoric often relied on vagueness, euphemism, and convoluted syntax to obscure reality rather than clarify it. Bureaucratic doublespeak and ideological jargon, he argued, were not just symptoms of lazy writing, but tools of oppression, designed to dull critical thinking and suppress dissent. Phrases like liquidation of counter-revolutionaries or enhanced interrogation techniques did not simply describe events. They reframed them in ways that numbed moral outrage and distanced people from the truth of what was happening. Orwell believed that clear language was not merely a literary virtue, but a moral necessity, a means of resisting the slow erosion of reality under the weight of propaganda. Orwell's insights into language remain strikingly relevant in an era of algorithm-driven misinformation, corporate spin, and the weaponization of digital discourse. Today, the tools of linguistic manipulation are more sophisticated and pervasive than ever. Politicians, media outlets, and online influencers shape narratives through selective framing, coded language, and viral repetition, ensuring that certain ideas dominate public consciousness while others are marginalized. Social media platforms, designed to amplify engagement rather than truth, accelerate the spread of emotionally charged but often misleading rhetoric, reinforcing ideological echo chambers. Orwell's fear that language could be used to manufacture consent and erase dissent has taken on new dimensions in the digital age, where reality itself can be reshaped through the mass reproduction of carefully curated phrases. Yet Orwell also believed that language could be reclaimed. His advocacy for plain, precise and honest writing was not just an aesthetic preference, but an act of political resistance. In a world where meaning is constantly contested, the ability to name things truthfully remains one of the most powerful tools against manipulation. Orwell's work challenges us to be vigilant about the words we use and the narratives we accept, reminding us that the struggle for clarity is inseparable from the struggle for freedom. Orwell's relationship with socialism was defined by both deep commitment and fierce critique. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who viewed socialism as a monolithic ideology, Orwell saw it as a contested space shaped by competing visions of equality, justice, and power. He was unwavering in his belief that socialism was the only moral alternative to capitalism, yet he remained deeply skeptical of how socialist movements operated in practice. His experiences in the Spanish Civil War exposed him to the brutal factionalism and authoritarian tendencies within leftist movements, leaving him disillusioned with Soviet-backed communism while reinforcing his belief in democratic socialism. He understood that socialism's greatest threat was not external opposition, but internal betrayal, when revolutionaries in their pursuit of power abandoned the principles they had set out to defend. In The Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell chronicled the harsh realities of working-class life in industrial Britain, exposing the economic exploitation and structural inequalities that made socialism a necessity rather than an abstract ideal. Yet he was equally critical of middle-class socialists, whom he saw as detached from the people they claimed to represent. He argued that many leftists were motivated not by genuine solidarity with the working class, but by intellectual fashion, personal guilt, or a desire for power. This critique set him apart from many of his contemporaries, who either romanticized the proletariat or dismissed them as politically unsophisticated. Orwell insisted that socialism could only succeed if it was grounded in real human experience rather than ideological purity. His criticism of authoritarian socialism was most vividly expressed in Animal Farm, an allegory that exposed the way revolutionary movements, when unchecked, replicate the very structures of oppression they sought to overthrow. The story of the pigs who gradually become indistinguishable from the humans they replaced was not just a condemnation of Stalinism, but a warning about the corruptibility of power itself. Orwell understood that revolutions do not automatically lead to freedom. Without accountability and a commitment to fundamental principles, they can become new forms of tyranny. This belief made him a staunch advocate for democratic socialism, one that resisted both capitalist exploitation and the bureaucratic authoritarianism that had come to define Soviet communism. Orwell's socialism was pragmatic rather than utopian. He did not believe in grand theories of historical inevitability, nor did he see socialism as a perfect system that would eliminate all human suffering. Rather, he saw it as a necessary counterforce to the dehumanizing effects of unchecked capitalism and state control. His vision of socialism was rooted in individual dignity, economic justice, and intellectual freedom, values he believed could only be preserved through constant vigilance and self-critique. In an era where political movements are increasingly defined by rigid ideological boundaries, Orwell's refusal to conform to simplistic narratives serves as a powerful reminder that true political integrity lies in the ability to challenge both one's enemies and one's allies. Orwell's Animal Farm is often misread as a simple allegory of Soviet communism, but its critique extends beyond Stalinism to the fundamental mechanics of power and revolution. At its core, the novella is a study of how ideals become corrupted, how revolutions can betray their own principles, and how language is manipulated to justify oppression. Orwell understood that political movements, no matter how well-intentioned, are vulnerable to the same forces of hierarchy, self-interest, and authoritarian control that they originally opposed. His depiction of the gradual transformation of the pigs from revolutionaries to despots is not merely a historical indictment. It is a timeless warning that power, left unchecked, inevitably consolidates itself at the expense of the very people it claims to liberate. The novel follows the trajectory of many real-world revolutions, in which initial unity gives way to factionalism, and leaders who once championed equality gradually become indistinguishable from the oppressors they overthrew. Orwell, who had fought in the Spanish Civil War and witnessed firsthand the purges and betrayals within the leftist factions, saw in history a repeating pattern. The erosion of revolutionary fervour into bureaucratic control, the silencing of dissent, and the construction of new hierarchies under the guise of ideological purity. Animal Farm is a case study in how revolutions are lost, not through external sabotage alone, but through internal decay, where slogans are rewritten, historical memory is altered, and dissenters are cast out in the name of stability. Language plays a central role in this process, as Orwell demonstrates through the ever-changing commandments of the farm. What begins as an egalitarian vision, all animals are equal, slowly transforms into the chilling revision. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This is not merely a clever literary device. It reflects Orwell's deep-seated concern with the ways in which political language can be used to distort meaning and justify oppression. The ability of those in power to redefine truth, to alter the past, and to control the present ensures their continued dominance. The animals, subjected to a constant reshaping of their reality, lose their ability to resist, not because they lack the will, but because they no longer possess the conceptual framework to articulate their oppression. Despite its bleak trajectory, Animal Farm is not a call to abandon revolutionary ideals. Orwell did not reject the notion of justice, equality, or the struggle against tyranny. Rather, he sought to expose the dangers of complacency, blind loyalty, and the unchecked concentration of power. The novel forces its readers to question the narratives of history, to scrutinize leaders who claim to act in the public interest, and to remain vigilant against the gradual erosion of freedom. In Orwell's view, revolutions do not fail because they are misguided from the outset, but because they lack the mechanisms of accountability that prevent power from entrenching itself. Surveillance has become more pervasive than Orwell could have ever imagined. In 1984, he envisioned a world where the state maintained control through constant monitoring, physical coercion, and ideological subjugation. While Orwell's nightmare was rooted in the crude brutality of totalitarian regimes, today's systems of surveillance operate on a more insidious and voluntary basis. The rise of corporate surveillance capitalism has shifted the locus of control from oppressive government oversight to omnipresent digital monitoring, where individuals willingly surrender their privacy in exchange for convenience, connectivity, and entertainment. Unlike the world of Big Brother, where citizens are forced into submission, modern surveillance thrives on participation, turning personal data into a commodity and self-surveillance into a cultural norm. Orwell's insights remain prophetic in their depiction of how power seeks not only to monitor but to shape reality. The telescreens in 1984 were not merely tools for watching but for conditioning behaviour, creating a population that internalized the logic of control. Today's digital landscape operates under a similar principle, as algorithms, targeted advertising, and predictive analytics curate individual experiences, nudging people towards certain behaviours while limiting their ability to think independently. The once clear boundary between state control and corporate power has blurred, with governments leveraging the vast data repositories of tech companies for surveillance, and private corporations acting as unelected gatekeepers of information and discourse. Orwell warned that authoritarian regimes would manipulate history to maintain control. But in the digital age, history itself is rewritten in real time through selective censorship, algorithmic bias, and the erosion of objective facts. The modern surveillance state is not just external, but internalized. In 1984, Winston Smith's greatest fear was not just being watched, but losing his ability to think independently. The party's goal was to make dissent not just punishable, but unthinkable, a reality that finds unsettling parallels in today's culture of self-censorship and social conformity. The omnipresence of surveillance, whether through government monitoring, corporate tracking, or social media scrutiny, has created an environment where people anticipate being observed, shaping their behaviour to align with prevailing norms. In doing so, individuals become complicit in their own subjugation, policing themselves in ways that negate the need for overt oppression. Orwell's concept of thought crime finds an unsettling parallel in the ways public discourse is shaped by outrage cycles, digital shaming, and the policing of acceptable speech. Yet Orwell did not believe that surveillance was inevitable or irreversible. His work serves as both a warning and a call to action, urging people to resist the forces that seek to commodify their thoughts and manipulate their perceptions. In an era where digital privacy is increasingly under threat, the question is no longer whether Orwell's vision has come true, but whether individuals and societies will recognise the mechanisms of control and fight against them. The challenge is not just to reject overt authoritarianism, but to dismantle the structures that normalise surveillance, to reclaim the ability to think freely in a world that seeks to preempt thought itself. Orwell believed that truth was not just under threat from authoritarian regimes, but from the erosion of intellectual integrity in all areas of public life. His writings consistently warned against the dangers of self-deception, ideological conformity, and the manipulation of facts for political convenience. In 1984, truth is not merely distorted, it is obliterated, replaced by the shifting dictates of the party. But Orwell understood that truth could be just as fragile in democratic societies, where propaganda, misinformation, and selective historical memory could create a reality as distorted as any imposed by force. He saw that the battle for truth was not just fought in government halls or media outlets, but within the individual's own capacity to think critically and resist the lure of comfortable lies. Orwell's commitment to truth was not abstract. It was forged through personal sacrifice and an unwavering dedication to intellectual honesty. His experience in the Spanish Civil War, where he saw firsthand how political factions manipulated facts to suit their own agendas, cemented his belief that even those who claimed to fight for justice could be guilty of deceit. This realization did not make him cynical, but it did make him relentlessly skeptical. He refused to align himself with any political group that demanded ideological purity at the expense of reality. His scathing critiques of both the right and the left made him an outcast in many circles, yet he persisted, convinced that the duty of a writer was not to comfort, but to challenge. For Orwell, writing was an act of ethical resistance. He believed that clarity, precision, and honesty in language were essential to preserving truth. In Politics and the English Language, he dissected how political discourse was often designed to obscure rather than reveal, warning that vague, euphemistic language allowed atrocities to be committed without moral reckoning. His call for simple, direct prose was not just a literary preference, it was a moral stance. To Orwell, imprecise language was not just bad writing, it was a tool of oppression, a means of dulling thought and numbing the conscience. His advocacy for clear and unembellished language was in essence an appeal for intellectual responsibility. Orwell's legacy as a truth-teller remains particularly relevant in an era dominated by misinformation, ideological polarization, and the erosion of trust in institutions. His work challenges contemporary readers to question dominant narratives, to seek out inconvenient facts, and to resist the temptation of easy answers. In a world where truth is increasingly shaped by algorithms, partisanship, and viral half-truths, Orwell's insistence on intellectual integrity stands as both a warning and a call to action. His life and work remind us that truth is not something passively received, but something actively defended, a principle that remains as urgent today as it was in his time. Orwell's mastery of language was not just a stylistic choice, but a deliberate act of resistance against the forces that sought to obscure truth. His writing was defined by clarity, precision, and an aversion to the rhetorical excesses that often accompanied political discourse. He understood that language could be a tool of both liberation and control, and he made it his mission to strip away obfuscation in favour of direct, unembellished prose. His insistence on plain speech was not a rejection of literary beauty, but a recognition that elegance and simplicity could coexist, that the most profound ideas could be expressed in the most unadorned terms. His prose, with its sharp clarity and rhythmic cadence, carried an authority that was both intellectual and emotional, ensuring that his arguments resonated with a wide audience. Orwell's approach to writing was deeply tied to his political beliefs. He saw the manipulation of language as one of the primary mechanisms through which authoritarianism maintained its grip on society, and he countered it by demonstrating that honest, straightforward writing was an ethical necessity. In Politics and the English Language, he dissected the ways in which political jargon, euphemisms, and vague abstractions serve to obscure reality rather than illuminate it. He argued that the decline of clear language was not merely an aesthetic problem, but a symptom of a deeper moral and intellectual decay. To Orwell, language that was unclear, dishonest, or needlessly complex was an indication of a writer either attempting to deceive or lacking the discipline to think critically. His demand for linguistic precision was, at its heart, a demand for intellectual integrity. This commitment to clarity made Orwell one of the most enduring literary figures of the 20th century. His works remain accessible to readers of all backgrounds, yet they contain layers of meaning that continue to yield insight upon closer analysis. His ability to craft sentences that were both striking and simple gave his writing an immediacy that was rare among political thinkers. Even in his most complex explorations of power, ideology, and freedom, his language remained grounded in the tangible, avoiding the abstract theorizing that often characterized political discourse. His literary style was an extension of his belief that truth should be transparent, that deception thrived in obscurity, and that the role of the writer was to shine a light where others sought to create shadows. In the digital age, where information overload and algorithmic manipulation have made the pursuit of clarity more difficult than ever, Orwell's insistence on precision remains a powerful lesson. His writing challenges contemporary readers to question not just what is being said, but how it is being said. The stylistic economy that defined his work serves as a reminder that writing should be an act of communication rather than obfuscation, that words should serve to reveal rather than conceal. Orwell's literary craft was not just about style, it was about truth, and in an era of misinformation and manufactured narratives, his lessons in clarity and honesty are more vital than ever. Orwell's influence has extended far beyond the political struggles of his own time, shaping contemporary debates on truth, power, and the limits of human freedom. His work has become a framework through which societies understand and critique the mechanisms of control, from government overreach to corporate hegemony. His insights into surveillance, propaganda, and ideological manipulation have only grown more relevant in an era where digital technology has amplified the tools of deception and self-censorship. The language of Orwellianism is now embedded in global discourse, invoked in discussions on authoritarianism, privacy, and the fragility of democracy. His warnings are no longer hypothetical. They describe the world as it is unfolding. Yet Orwell's legacy is not just that of a prophet, but of a moral guide, one who demonstrated the necessity of intellectual courage in times of mass conformity. His insistence on truth, even when it was inconvenient or dangerous, remains one of his most enduring lessons. In an age where narratives are increasingly fragmented and reality itself seems contested, Orwell reminds us that the pursuit of clarity and honesty is not just a literary ideal, but an ethical responsibility. His work challenges individuals to resist the seductions of ideology, to question their own assumptions, and to recognize the subtle ways in which power reshapes perception. He understood that the fight against tyranny was not just a matter of political struggle, but of preserving the ability to think independently in the face of overwhelming pressure. The persistence of Orwell's ideas is a testament to their foundational importance in modern intellectual life. His ability to distill complex political realities into compelling narratives ensures that his work remains accessible to each new generation, serving as both a warning and a call to vigilance. His writing compels readers to recognize the patterns of oppression that repeat throughout history, and to understand that resistance begins not with grand gestures, but with the refusal to accept convenient falsehoods. He showed that history is not just written by the victors, but shaped by those who challenge official accounts, who expose uncomfortable truths, and who refuse to be complicit in their own subjugation. As the world continues to grapple with disinformation, rising authoritarianism, and the erosion of democratic norms, Orwell's legacy offers both insight and inspiration. His work is not a relic of the past, but a living document, an ongoing conversation about the nature of power and the responsibilities of those who seek to challenge it. His call to intellectual honesty and ethical resistance remains as urgent as ever, reminding us that the struggle for truth is never finished. Orwell did not provide easy answers, but he left behind a roadmap for those willing to question, to challenge, and to think freely. His greatest lesson is that the fight against oppression is fought first and foremost in the mind, and that the cost of surrendering one's ability to reason is far greater than the risks of dissent. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform